Thank you, Daniel, Minister. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here amongst leaders and activists all around. First of all, I'm the president of the Seattle chapter of the A. Philip Randolph Institute. I'm also a member of the International Longshore and Whales Union, Local 52. And first, I want to start with a brief history of A. Philip Randolph, because we cannot talk about the Institute unless we talk about the man that created the Institute. Asa Philip Randolph was born April 15, 1988 in Crescent City, Florida. He died May 16, 1979 in New York. Randolph was a trade unionist and a civil rights leader who was a dedicated and persistent leader in the struggle for justice and priority in the Black American community. The son of a Methodist minister, Randolph moved to the Harlem district of New York in 1911. He attended City College at night and with Chandler Owens founded in 1912 an employment agency attended City College at night and with Chandler Owens attended through it to organize Black workers in 1917 following the entry of the United States in the World War I. The two men founded a magazine, The Messenger. After 1929, Black workers, they called for more position in the war industry and the armed forces for Blacks. After the war, Randolph lectured at the New York Rand School of Social Science and ran unsuccessfully for office on the Socialist Party ticket. In 1925, as founding president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Randolph began to organize that group of Black workers. And at that time, when half the affiliate of the American Federation of Labor barred Blacks from membership, he took his union into the AFL. Despite opposition, he built the first successful Black trade union, the Brotherhood, won his first major contract with the Pullman Company in 1937. The following year, Randolph removed his union from the AFL in protest against his failure to fight discrimination in his rank and took the Brotherhood into the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organization, the CIO. At the end, returned to the question of Black employment in the federal government and in the industry with federal contract. He warned President Franklin D. Roosevelt that he will lead thousands of Black in a protest march on Washington, D.C. Roosevelt on June 25, 1941, issued an Executive Order 8802, barring discrimination in the defense industry and Federal Bureau and creating the Fair Employment Practice Committee. After World War II, Randolph founded the League for Nonviolence, Civil Disobedience Against Military Segregation, resulting in an issue by President Harry S. Truman on July 26, 1948 of Executive Order 9981, banning segregation in the Army forces. When the AFL merged with the CIO in 1955, Randolph was made the vice president and member of the Executive Council of the combined organization. He was the first president in 1960 to 63 of the Negro American Labor Council, formed by Randolph and others to fight discrimination within the AFL-CIO. In the echo of this activity of 1941, Randolph was a director of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which brought more than 250 persons to the Capitol on August 28, 1963 to demonstrate support for civil rights policy for Blacks. Now, the march identified by Randolph's Deputy Director Byron Rustin as a watershed event of the civil rights movement, brought more than 250 participants to Washington Mall, the largest demonstration in the nation capital up to that time, to demonstrate popular support for civil rights legislation pending in Congress and for broad economic goals, including full employment to be achieved through governmental action. Through his career, Randolph believed the moral objective of equality and justice could be secured only through fundamental change in the economic structure of American society. He insisted that civil rights legislation by itself would not solve deeply rooted inequities in American life, and the African American will never lose their status as second-class citizen until opportunities for economic and educational advancement were guaranteed to all on an equal basis. In pursuance of that perspective, he successfully changed US president and pursued them to support his agenda. The son of an African-American Methodist Episcopal preacher in a small community in Florida, Randolph migrated to Harlem at the age of 22, after finding that the employment opportunity available to him in the South were limited to manual labor jobs due to racial discrimination embedded in the region's legal system and social fabric. In New York, Randolph similarly found that, in his word, that the jobs Negroes could get when worth spending much time on. At City College of New York, he immersed himself into the radical thoughts for which the school was noted, and also became involved in Harlem politics and the labor movement. Randolph and his colleague founded the Socialist Journal, The Messenger, in November 1970 as an editor. He provided his predominantly Black audience with an alternative vision to then dominant orientation of Booker T. Washington, who stressed Black economic progress through self while accommodating the segregation practiced by W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that a Negro elite should pressure civil rights legislation for the benefit of all. And Marcus Garvey, leader of the populist Black nationalist Back to Africa movement, the Messenger advocate labor unionism, socialism, and working class solidarity, protested World War I, blame racial prejudice and capitalism. I issue a call for revolution, a complete change in the organization of society in response to the increase of violence against Blacks spreading in the post-war period. Convinced that the fight for Negro masses will be the greatest service I can render to my people, Randolph abandoned radicalism in the 1920s for more pragmatic endeavors. In 1925, he helped organize the first Black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. After porters working for the Pullman Company requested that he lead the effort to press for better pay and working conditions, he aided by the American Federation of Labor. The union succeeded in 1937 after a long struggle to pressure the powerful Pullman Company to agree on a contract, the first ever between a major corporation and a Black union. Historians have placed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the vanguard of the early grassroots civil rights movement, as its members routinely function as carriers to distribute political literature in their travel and to speak. Organization drive E.D. Nixon and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters members since the 1920s and local activists in Montgomery, Alabama devised the idea to organize the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, after Rosa Parks Nixon collided in the local branch of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, was arrested for refusing to give up a seat on a bus to a white passenger. Nixon also entreated a young local pastor, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to endorse the boycott. King emerged as a prominent civil rights leader after he was chosen to lead the group formed to organize the boycott. Nixon often credited his own initial involvement in the civil rights movement to Randolph. When I heard Randolph speak, he was like a light. He later remembered, he done more to bring me in the fight for civil rights than anybody before that time. I figured that a Negro would be kicked around and accept whatever the white man did. I never knew the Negro had a right to enjoy freedom like everyone else. Randolph's first spoke about organizing a march on Washington, D.C. in December of 1940. As the U.S. economy improved and a Great Depression ended due to the rise in defense-related production in preparation for a possible war. Aware that Blacks were systemically excluded from defense industry jobs, Randolph issued a call for pilgrimage of 10,000 Negroes to wake up and shock official Washington as it has never been shocked before. Fearing violence and not wanting to antagonize Southern Congressmen, President Franklin D. Roosevelt invited Randolph and the NAACP head, Walter White, to a meeting at the White House in June 1941 to get them to call off the march. Both leaders told the president they expect more than 100,000 Blacks to come to the city. Roosevelt offered to pressure defense contractors to hire Black workers and to set up a grievance board to investigate changes of discrimination. Randolph insisted, however, that Roosevelt issued an executive order prohibiting defense industry discrimination. The president complied, and Randolph's victorious encounter with Roosevelt recounted in the press club talk, resulting in the creation of the Fair Employment Practice Committee that lasted during the war. Units in the Army forces still were segregated according to the race. However, in 1948, Randolph called for a new march on Washington, to complete with civil disobedience and tactic modeled on the successful struggle for independence in India of Mahatma Gandhi movement. After President Harry S. Truman announced plans for a bill authorized a universal military training program with no stipulation that segregation in the military would end, Randolph perceived that because the better military jobs and training opportunity went to whites, a segregated army result in diminishing opportunity for Black. Like Roosevelt before him, Truman met with Randolph to try to dissuade him. Randolph argued the president when he stated Negroes are in no mood to shoulder a gun for democracy abroad so long as they are denied democracy here at home. 9 days later, Randolph also upset members of the Senate Armed Service Committee, holding UMT hearings when he testified that unless segregation and discrimination in the military were abolished, he would organize a Gandhi-like campaign by millions of Negroes. He told the committee passage no of a Jim Crow draft may only result in a mass civil disobedience movement along the lines of the magnificent struggle of the people of India against British imperialism. He voted to call upon all Negro veterans to join the civil disobedience movement and to recruit their younger brothers in an organized refusal to register and be drafted, and threatened to appeal to the thousands of white youth in school and college who are today vigorous, shedding the prejudice of their parents and professors. After the UMT bill was signed into law in June 1948 without provision to prohibit segregation, Randolph co-founded the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience Against Military Segregation to carry out his threat. Complementing Randolph's effort, delegates from the Democratic National Convention led by Minneapolis Mayor Hubert H. Humphrey passed a plank in the party's platform calling for desegregation of the Army forces in opposition to Truman's wishes. Facing a tough re-election campaign with a splintering party, Truman capitulated and signed 2 executive orders to establish the fair employment practice within the federal government and to end segregation in the military. Randolph called off the campaign. As with the 2 predecessors who clashed with Randolph, President John F. Kennedy initially opposed Randolph's plan for a march on Washington. Randolph and Bayard Rustin had formulated plans for the march in December 1962 to press for a public work program to combat unemployment. Rustin initially envisioned a 2-day protest, including a mass dissent on Congress of labor, church, and civil rights delegation to present legislative demand. Aware that Martin Luther King Jr. also had announced plans for a march to pressure the government for new civil rights legislation, Randolph and Rustin coordinated with King's Group, the Southern Christian Leaders Conference, and leaders from the NAACP, the Council for Racial Equality, the National Urban League, and the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee to co-sponsor the march. 4 white religious and labor leaders later joined the organizing group. On June 11, 1963, in response to 2 months of protest in Birmingham, Alabama, and violent police reprisal, and to action by Alabama Governor George Wallace to attempt to stop the integration of the University of Alabama, Kennedy announced in a televised speech to the nation that he planned to send to Congress comprehensive civil rights legislation. Afraid that the planned march could interfere with his legislation initiative, Kennedy met with march leaders on June 22nd to try to get them to call it off. Kennedy aides Arthur Schlesinger called the encounter the best meeting I attended in my years in the White House. Kennedy, according to Schlesinger, told them, "We want success in Congress, not just a big show at the Capitol. Some of these people are looking for an excuse to be against us. I don't want to give any of them a chance to say yes for the bill, but I'm damned if I will vote for it at the point of a gun." Randolph argued with the quiet dignity which touched Kennedy as it had touched Roosevelt before him, as recounted by Schlesinger, that Blacks already were protesting in the street and that they probably could not be dissuaded. He asked the president, if they are bound to be in the street, in any case, it is not better than they be led by organizations dedicated to civil rights and disciplined by struggle rather than to leave them to other leaders who care neither about civil rights nor about nonviolence. While agreeing that demonstration in the street had stimulated his administration to act, Kennedy contended that during the legislation process faced potentially violence in country would be counterproductive and might hurt this chance for re-election. He remarked, "We may all go down the drain as a result of this." According to Schlesinger, the civil rights leader were persuaded not to lay siege to Capitol Hill. The planned event was changed to a one-day event with a symbolic march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial and speeches by march leaders. Kennedy supported the revised plan and agreed to meet with the leaders at the day conclusion. On August 11, the Washington Post published a complimentary profile of Bayard Rustin, the chief organizer of the march, who had coordinated with Randolph a prayer pilgrimage to Washington. In 1957, a youth march for integrated school, and in 1958 and 1959, 2 days later, the segregationist senator from South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, who had been trying to taint march leaders as linked to communists, castigate the post from the Senate floor for his whitewash of Rustin past, armed with information provided by the FBI. Thurmond charged that Rustin was a former communist, that he had been imprisoned during World War II as a pacifist and had been arrested in 1953 for sex perversion with 2 other men. Thurmond also attacked Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's effort to whitewash the question of communist influence or involvement of these Negro demonstrations, which have been turned into race riot in various cities in this country. Thurmond attack served to unify civil rights leaders in the defense of Rustin, who explained to the press that he never had been a member of the Communist Party, or that he had joined the Young Communist League as a student in the late 1930s because he thought they were deeply concerned with social justice. As a Quaker and pacifist, he explained, he had refused military service during World War II and willingly has surrendered to authority. Rustin declined to respond to the sex perversion charges, stating, "This for my peers to judge me and my life." After the NAACP head Roy Wilkins earlier objected to Rustin as a possible director of the march because of his liability. He and other leaders now relied to Rustin's support. Randolph stated, "I am sure I speak for the combined Negro leadership in voicing my complete confidence in Bayard Rustin's character, integrity, and extraordinary ability." A biography of Rustin as note, with the dignified Randolph as spokesman, journalists did not ask probing question about sexual perversion at the press club. Randolph reiterated his faith in Rustin. On the day before the march, a draft of a planned speech to be delivered to the SNCC chairman, John Lewis, was circulated to the press. Lewis' tone is in comparison with that of the other speech was defiant and accusatory. He detailed reason that Kennedy civil rights legislation was too little and too late. He castigated cheap political leaders who built their careers on immoral compromise and allied themselves with open forms of political, economic, and social exploitation. He criticized the federal government for arresting civil rights leaders engaged in peaceful protests, for refusing to press charges against police who viciously attacked protesters. In response to those who urged activists to be patient and wait, Lewis' original text read, "We must say that patient is a dirty and nasty word. We cannot be patient. We do not want to be free gradually." He contended they could not rely on the two major political parties, but that the people, the masses themselves, must bring about the necessary changes evolved. The time will come when we will not confine or march into Washington. We will march through the South, to the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. We shall pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground, non-violently. When the Archbishop of Washington, the most Reverend Patrick O'Bale, who was scheduled to open the speech at the Lincoln Memorial with an invocation learned of Lewis' speech, he threatened to withdraw from the march. Rustin tried to talk Lewis into deleting the more provoking patches, but Lewis refused. Rustin then put together a committee to devise a solution and assure that O'Bale that the speech will be changed. Randolph, as part of the committee, implored Lewis and others SNCC members to cooperate. "I have waited 22 years for this," he told them. I have waited all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it." With deep respect for Randolph, Lewis agreed to edit the more offending rhetoric without compromising the message. In his own speech at the march, Randolph called attention to the message of people who attended and gathering whose numbers far exceeded expectation. He stated, "Let the nation and the world know the meaning of our numbers and identify the assembly marches as the advance guard as a massive moral resolution for jobs and freedom." Randolph's speech, the first of the day, has been overshadowed in most accounts of the march by that of the final speaker, Dr. King, who Randolph introduced as the man who personified the moral leadership of the civil rights revolution. King's momentous "I Have a Dream" speech brought the march to a rousing conclusion and became the day-defining event for many. As the participants left the Lincoln Memorial, Rustin put his arm around Randolph's shoulder and said, "Mr. Randolph, it looks like a dream has come true." Rustin later remembered that tears were streaming down his cheeks. "It is the one time I can recall that he could not hold back his feeling." Following the speech, the leaders of the march met with Kennedy, who affirmed Randolph's goal of economic justice. The executive branch of the federal government will continue its effort to obtain increased employment and to eliminate discrimination in employment practice. Two of the prime goals of the march, Kennedy stated, the nation can't afford to achieve the goals of a full employment policy. It cannot afford to permit the potential skills and educational capacity of the citizens to be unrealized. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Rustin has written, the agenda spelled out and the March on Washington in 1963 had been secure in all but one important respect: for economic demands, the needs for more and better jobs, an expanded housing program, better education, as well as integrated school, are still to be won. In 1966, in conjunction with A. Philip Randolph Institute, which had been established in 1964, and in alliance with a coalition of civil rights, labor, and religious leaders and others public intellectuals, Randolph and Rustin submitted a comprehensive proposal to Congress designed to make the goal of a full employment a reality, citing as precedent the Full Employment Act that Roosevelt conceived in 1945 to prevent a post-war depression, and Truman's 1947 Marshall Plan to rebuild war-torn Europe. The Freedom Budget for All Americans, a 10-year plan with a cost set at $185 billion, aimed to provide government jobs for socially desirable projects, a guarantee annual income for all workers, increase in minimum wage, farm income, welfare service, and social security payment, and the eradication of slum. The plan chief economist, Dr. Leon K. Selling, who formerly had drafted some of Roosevelt New Deal legislation and had been the chairman of Truman Council of Economic Advisors, maintained that increased consumption resulting from increased income would provide economic growth dividends by stimulating production and thus create more than $400 billion in taxes. Randolph stated that not since the March on Washington has there been such broad sponsorship and enthusiastic support as has been mobilized in behalf of the Freedom Budget for All Americans. The plan, which dwarfed the President Lyndon Johnson War and Poverty Program, received little enthusiasm in Congress or the White House. However, it soon focused their attention elsewhere, some disagreeing with the program creators who claimed that expected revenue could accommodate a rise in defense expenditure need to fight the war in Vietnam, which Randolph and Rustin have refused to address in the proposal. In addition, many younger Black activists had rejected the interracial approach that Randolph and Rustin believed was needed to achieve long-standing economic advance for Black. In 1968, Randolph and Rustin further antagonized Black militants, some called the two Uncle Toms, by supporting a teacher union striking to protest community control of New York City school, a position advocated by poor Blacks and Puerto Ricans, some of who wanted to exclude white teachers from their school, local school. Randolph, who served as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Puerto Union president since the 1920s, and as a vice president of the AFL-CIO Executive Council since merged Union First Convention in 1955, retired from both positions in the summer of 1968 following an illness. At his death in Harlem apartment at the age of 90 in 1979. And as I talk about Randolph, we also have to talk about Dr. King, because that's the connection that was going to bring us back to what I want to bring us back to where we are now today. Martin Luther King knew that there was nothing peaceful about nonviolence if you are doing it right. The establishment pointed love to cite Martin Luther King as a way to legitimize militant protests and shame unruly protesters, but to him, nonviolent action could coincide ruling elites into conceding to demands for justice. In 1952, at 23 years old, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a love letter to Coretta Scott, along with coups of affection and apology for his hasty handwritten. He described his feeling not just toward his future wife, but also toward America's economic system. I'm much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, he admitted to his then girlfriend, concluding that capitalism has outlived its uselessness. King composed these words as a graduate student on the tail end of his first year at the Boston University School of Theology, and from representing just the utopianism of youth, The view expressed in this letter will go on to inform King's economic vision through his life. As an American honor King on his birthday, it's important to remember that the civil rights icon was also a democratic socialist committed to building a broad movement to overcome failing of capitalism and achieve both racial and economic equality for our people. Capitalism has brought about systems that take necessities from the massive to give luxury to the classes. King wrote in his 1952 letter to Scott. He will echo the sentiment 15 years later in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Capitalism has often left gap of superficials. Wealth and object poverty and has created conditions permitting necessity to be taken from the many to give luxury to the few. In his famous 1967 Riverdale church speech, King thundered, when machines and computer profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. And in an interview with the New York Times in 1968, King described his work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference this way. In a sense, you could say we are engaged in a class struggle. Speaking at a staff retreat in the Southern Christian Leaders Conference in 1966, for a minute, I got to make sure I don't get cut off from my system here. Got to plug in my charger. Okay. Speaking at a staff retreat in the Southern Christian Leaders Conference in 1960, King said that something is wrong with capitalism and there must be a better distribution of wealth in the country. Maybe suggested America must move toward democratic socialism. And where do we go from here, which called for the full emancipation and equality of Negroes and the poor? King advocate policies in line with our democratic socialist program, a guarantee annual income constitutional amendment to secure social economic equality and greatly expanded public housing. He endorsed the freedom budget brought forward by socialist activist A. Philip Randolph, which includes such policy as a job guarantee, a living wage, universal health care. He also outlines how economic equality can circumscribe civil rights, while the wealth enjoy easy access to lawyers and the court. The poor, however, are helpless. He writes, this emphasis on poverty is not always reflected in the contemporary teaching about King, which tend to focus strictly on his advocacy for civil rights. But where do we go from here? On the final project of King Life, the Poor People Campaign showed that King dreams include future of both racial and economic equality. What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter? King is widely quoted as asking, if you can afford to buy a hamburger. In King's view, the Greensboro lunch counter sitting, the voter registration drive across the South, and the Selma to Montgomery March compromise, but the first phase of the civil rights movement. And where do we go from here? King's called the victory of the movement. Up that point in 1967, a foothold no more in the struggle for freedom, only a campaign to realize economic as well as racial justice could win through equality for African American. Naming this goal, King was unflinching the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty. The shortcoming of the first phase of the civil rights movement to King was his emphasis on opportunity rather than guarantee the ability to buy hamburger at a lunch counter without harassment, did not guarantee that the hungry will be fed. Access to the ballot box did not guarantee anti-racist legislation. The end of Jim Crow laws did not guarantee the flourishing of African-American community. Descending did not guarantee equality. Some white people had gone along with the fight for access and opportunity. King concluded, because it cost them nothing. Jobs, however, are harder and costlier to create than voting rolls. When African Americans sought not only to be treated with dignity, but guarantee fair housing and education, many whites abandoned the movement. In King's word, as soon as they demand the realization of equality, the second phase of civil rights movement, he discovered whites suddenly indifferent. King considered the Poor People Campaign to be the vehicle for his next phase of the movement, besides because it offered both material advance and the potential for struggle, cross-racial organizing. For King, only a multi-racial working class movement, which the Poor People Campaign aspired to be, could guarantee both racial and economic equality. King was disgusted by the juxtaposition of decadence and destitution in America. He compressed our abundance into the overfed mouth of the middle and upper class, and today gap with superfluity. He fumed, quoting social justice advocate Ayman Bookbinder. King wrote that ending poverty in America merely requires demanding that the rich become even richer at a slower rate. For King, the only solution to America's crisis of poverty was the redistribution of wealth. In a 1961 speech to the Negro American Labor Council, King declared, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, for there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children. From his early letter to Coretta Scott until the final days, King put forward a vision of a society that provides equality for people of all race and background. This is the cause King spent his life fighting for, and it's one of that should be recommit to honor his legacy. Now, as I speak about King, I want to make it clear that in King as a civil rights movement, when he talk about distribution of wealth and he talk about economic justice, he also means that as we talk about freedom, we will never be free unless we get economic justice. And one of the things is he recognized that working with A. Philip Randolph, that connection with the labor movement was a critical point to where Blacks can be part of a union and maybe reach to the level of economic justice where they can make a living wage and up their living condition and be able to afford to have the benefit that be enjoyed by white. And I want to say this because 6 months before King was assassinated, King went and spoke at a union meeting at the International Longshore and Wales Union, Local 10 in San Francisco. That's one of the most militant union on the West Coast, Longshore Union on the West Coast. And I'm right in front of me, I'm sitting here with a book that was written by brother Clarence Thomas, who's a third generation and retired member of the International Longshore and Wales Union. That Clarence Thomas in the White, at the Supreme Court. I'm talking to real Clarence Thomas. And I would describe Clarence Thomas as a leading African-American trade unionist, past secretary, treasurer, and executive board members of ILW Local 10. He wrote this on his book on mobilizing in our own name. And this book came from organizing that was done back in 2004. Can you guys give me a minute? My power is getting short and I need to make sure I don't get cut off while I'm speaking. I got to unplug. Okay, sorry. So the Million Worker March was organized by Black trade unionists. And Clarence Thomas has been involved in many things, and he was instrumental as a young student to organize together. He's the best friend of Danny Glover, actor and activist, and they both attended San Francisco College. They was instrumental in organizing, establishing the first Black study department, a school of ethnic study in the country, and both still exist today. And that was at San Francisco State. He was a member of the Black Panther Party when he was young, and he grew up to be an activist and ended up being a longshoreman in one of the most prominent black, mostly black union in the ILW. And one of the things that people need to understand, the reason the ILW exists today is because labor leader by the name of Harry Bridges, when the ILW was on strike back in 1934, fighting for a better condition, better work on a union hall, not controlled by the employers. The employers was bringing people from the blacks from the South to come across the picket line to work at that on the ports. And Harry Bridges, being a great leader, he understood that Black life mattered, and back in 1934. So he went to the black churches and the community and talked to the religious leader and say, if you can talk to the black community and tell them that if we win this strike, we'll open the door to bring black into the union. And that's why today, right now, there's more black in Local 10 in San Francisco than it is in any other ILW, International Longshore Unions on the West Coast. And that's because blacks held back from crossing the picket line and allowed the ILW to win that contract. And now there's more, at least 80% of that local is mostly black. But I'm saying this because 6 months before Dr. King was assassinated, he went to speak at Local 10 in San Francisco. And I will talk about that because this connect to show that the march on Washington did not stop there. It continued. And I mean, that means that there's other action happening after that. And I will start with in analyzing, and this book, The Million Worker March, is an organization that was formed by Black trade unionists. In analyzing the Million Worker March and putting it into a historical context, you have to first look at the 1940. On January 25, 1941, A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, proposed the idea of national mobilization of African Americans for a march on Washington movement. The purpose was to pursue President Franklin Roosevelt and end discrimination on the government and army forces. There were many similarities between the March on Washington in 1941 and the Million Worker March in 2004. The march was intended to independent, militant, political mass movement led by African-American trade unionists, organized independently of the Democratic Party and the officialdoms of the labor, with chapters organized across the country. In 1941, President Roosevelt opposed the March on Washington, having a march and rally at the U.S. Capitol. In 2004, the Democratic Party did not want the Million Worker March to have a march and rally at the Lincoln Memorial. Both marches appealed to the wage and unwaged workers and not elected officials. There were two prominent differences between the March on Washington and the Million Worker March. The March on Washington canceled its mobilization because of the deal that was reached between Randolph and Roosevelt, issuing Executive Order 8802, which prohibit discrimination in the federal vocational and training program, established the first fair employment practice committee, and ended discrimination in high-end in the defense industry contracting with the government. And Randolph wanted to minimize the participation of white. He is quoted as saying, "There are some things Negro must do alone." And you can see that in tinurl.com and see the contest in it. The Million Worker March happened and 10,000 people attended the march and rally at the Lincoln Memorial on October 17, 2004. And the Million Worker March, we showed to the entire multinational working class. The Democratic Party and the officialdom of labor wanted the Million Worker to call it off. They offered no concession, and the Million Worker March was not considering any. They used the excuse that it was the wrong time. It was a good idea, but the wrong time. Suggesting it will be organize the next year after the presidential election. But the Million Worker March continue to organize. The tendency of the labor movement, the Million Worker March represented a tendency within the trade union movement that has manifested itself for several decades. That tendency of a Black rank and file militancy that is unafraid to express an independent movement that is willing to challenge the more passive tradition of the officialdom of labor and its masters, the Democratic Party. An example of this is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, formed in Detroit, Michigan in 1969. They brought together various revolutionary union movements that were forming inside of the auto industry and other industrial sectors. It was developed during a period of increasingly militancy and revolutionary consciousness in the Black working class movement. The Million Worker March was initiated by African-American longshore workers of Local 10 of the International Longshore and Whalers Union in San Francisco. It's the only predominant African-American local in the entire West Coast Longshore Division. With a long and glorious radical history that is well documented, it is the vanguard of the fight for economic and social justice in the labor movement. In 1934, Black workers play a key role in the victory at the West Coast waterfront strike in San Francisco. The militancy unit and power of that victory still reverberate up and down the West Coast today. And I mentioned about the 1935 Great West Coast waterfront strike, where Albert Bridges and Henry Smith and other rank and file strike leaders struck a mighty blow against white supremacy as it relates to the employer's use of Black workers crossing picket line during the strike, as well as challenging discrimination within the labor movement. They appealed directly to the Black community and the Bay Area through the Black churches to support the strike and not cross the picket line. The union made a commitment to bring African American on the waterfront and to be a part of the union. In so doing, they demonstrate that Black Lives Matter in 1934, and that strategy was the key to winning on the waterfront and successfully organizing the ILW. No, that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. on September 21st, 1967, 6.5 months before he was assassinated, Dr. King spoke at the ILW Local 10 membership meeting. He was given an honorable lifetime membership in the union. William Bill Chester introduced Dr. King at the historic union meeting. King said, "I don't feel like a stranger in the midst of the ILW. We have been strengthened and energized by the support you have given to our struggle. What we need is a radical distribution of political and economic power so that in a nation almost sick with wealth, there will not be so much poverty," he said. "If the nation cannot provide full employment, then it must grant minimum guarantee and annual income. We are going to organize the unorganized. Poverty after is not only among unemployed. Most of the poverty-stricken are people who are working every day. We will organize to make clear that everyone in this country has a right to a living income." And you can see on the ILW Dispatcher, volume 25, September 29, 1967. There is an iconic photograph of Local 10 Iron Hall that features Dr. King, Thomas L. Berkeley, publisher and chairman of the Oakland Port Board of Commission, and William Bill Chester. A framed copy of this photo was presented to Martin Luther King III at the Million Worker March event. The Million Worker, which he spoke on the same platform that his father spoke in 1963. The Million Worker March mission statement reflects Dr. King's statement at Local 10 on the 1968 Poor People March in Washington that he initiated with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was carried forward by Ron Abernathy in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. The Million Worker March mobilization was not to be denied due to the national election, lack of resources, and undeniable opposition of the AFL-CIO for the Democratic Party. The Million Worker March was born out of the Iraq-Afghanistan War Workers Movement to put people's needs above the bipartisan support of the military budget and war machine. The Million Worker March was held 41 years later at the Lincoln Memorial, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and where his son, Martin Luther King III, spoke at the Million Worker March in 2004. Now, I want to tell you this. It was a struggle when we started to organize, because I participated in that Million Worker March, organizing as well. From here in Seattle, I was organizing workers to go to that march. And I was a member of my local ILW Local 19. And I was the chair of the education committee. I was doing a lot, giving people information, too much information, I should say. So they wanted to put me busy. So they decided to make me be the key person to organizing for that march in DC. And when I asked for donation, I received $500 from my union. So in saying that, it was like they was not trying to really help to make it happen. They just wanted to act like they was doing something. I was kind of offended, and what I did, I called my mentor, Leo Robinson. Leo Robinson is a very instrumental leader, a person who organized the, he was a member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unions in San Francisco, Bay Area, and he organized a community picket to boycott the South African ship till Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And that ship ended up bouncing all over the world and nobody would unload it. And that was instrumental in the release, play a part in the release of Nelson Mandela. But in saying so, this particular person, Leo Robinson, I brought him to my local. And when he finished speaking, the whole room was so silent. When he was done, they voted to give $5,000 more to the movement. And they did. But Leo Robinson, a retired longshoreman at that time, because of our leadership, because of the AFL-CIO and the Democratic Party who met at the Kennedy compound and decided that this was a good idea, but it's the wrong time. They was focusing on getting John Kerry elected, which failed. Did not want to spend money in organizing this. But Leo Robinson came up with the first $50,000 out of his own retirement money to put forward for this event to happen. That makes him one of the most important person in the ILW. Because he
Maybe we have 3 minutes.
Refused was to fail. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up. But this is just carrying on the history of A. Philip Randolph, carrying on the movement, and to say that the movement is cannot stop. And I didn't know I talked that much. but I know you wanted me to touch on some other subject like the
dispatch from today.
Yeah. Huh? Yeah, that but the 13th Amendment, I think you wanted me to touch on that, didn't you?
Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch. Right now, we in Seattle, we created a committee, and we've been working with part of organizing for Juneteenth, and we passed a tremendous resolution through ILW convention into supporting Juneteenth and making it a pay holidays for workers. But our committee here in Seattle, we started a petition to amend the 13th Amendment. And the section in the 13th Amendment that we are focusing is, we have the Emancipation Proclamation that says free. There's no more slavery in America, but through the prison system, industrial system, they're still using prisoners to do slave labor, paying them $1 a day or whatever. So our section that we want to take out is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except a punishment for crime, wherefore the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And what we're saying, we want that to be amended and removed. And we believe that if you put in people in prison to work, you should pay them livable wages. They should be able to, when they get out of prison, able to have their the option to keep that job. If we want to end violence or crime, then we have to have a solution. And this is part of the solution. If you are making sure that if you are using incarcerated people to do work, that they get paid livable wages, prevailing wages, and they have the opportunity to keep that job. We need, if we're going to stop talk about slavery is done, we have to completely eradicate slavery, whether it's been in the industrial system, prison system, or outside. We know it is our struggle. We know it is a fight because we still fighting the same fight that we fight back in the past, but this is just our blueprint start to make change into trying to really acknowledge what Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation means to Blacks and people here and working class people. So I'll stop there. Well, I mean, that's the lead time for question.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriel, for the history, because sometimes you have to be brought back to where we are today and where we came from. So, and thank you so much for taking time out to come and be with us today.